The night he didn't turn off the office lights, I told myself he must have just been tired, but a part of me knew the truth long before I was brave enough to say it out loud. I always thought the beginning of a mistake would sound loud, like a door slamming or a warning whispered against my ear, but the truth came softer than that. It arrived in the way he looked at me across the desk one late evening, the glow from the computer screens tracing the outline of his face, while the rest of the office sank into darkness. I remember thinking he looked tired, worn down by the endless deadlines and the weight of running a business that neither of us had ever been fully prepared for. But when he lifted his eyes, something else flickered there, something that made my breath catch even though I pretended not to notice. The printer clicked in the background, spitting out papers neither of us cared about, while he leaned back in his chair as if studying a puzzle. I didn't ask what he was thinking. I was afraid that if I did, he would tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I focused on the tapping of my own fingers against the keyboard, pretending that the rhythm could keep my heart steady. It didn't. Every second that passed stretched thinner, like a thread pulled too tight. We'd spent years building the company, pouring everything into it, our savings, our weekends, our last reserves of hope. That kind of work knits people together in ways no one warns you about. You start finishing each other's sentences without noticing, start relying on each other's strengths without admitting how much you need them. Somewhere along the way, dependence blurred into familiarity, and familiarity blurred into something dangerously close to longing. He stood up first. He always did when the nights got long. But instead of packing his bag, he walked toward my desk. I didn't look up right away. I was afraid of what I'd find if I did. When I finally forced myself to meet his eyes, the room felt smaller, as if the walls had moved in while we weren't watching. There was no smile on his face, no joke waiting on his tongue. Just that quiet searching, like he was waiting for me to give him permission to feel something neither of us had ever spoken aloud. "Long night," he said softly. I nodded, though that wasn't the truth. The night didn't feel long, it felt suspended, caught between what was appropriate and what was inevitable. My voice barely worked when I tried to answer. His hand rested on the back of my chair, close enough to feel the warmth of him. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Outside, the parking lot lamps hummed against the glass, their pale light sliding across the floor like restless shadows. I wondered if they could see us, two people pretending they weren't teetering on the edge of something that could ruin everything. I wondered if anyone ever knew the exact moment their life began to shift. He didn't say anything else that night, but he didn't need to. The silence between us felt charged, like a confession waiting to take shape. When he finally stepped away, the air cooled, and I realized how close he'd been without ever touching me. When I gathered my things, I tried convincing myself I had imagined it all, the look, the tension, the fragile beat of something forbidden. But as I walked out and locked the door behind me, my hands trembled just enough to betray me. The night air hit my face, crisp and unkind, and I knew deep down that a line had already formed between us. A line we would both pretend not to see, at least for a little while. I sat in my car longer than I should have, fingers curled around the steering wheel while the engine hummed beneath me. The radio played something soft, something forgettable, but all I could hear was the echo of his voice. I kept replaying the moment he leaned close, the way his breath stirred the air near my cheek, the way my pulse betrayed me even though nothing happened. On the drive home, the city lights blurred into streams of gold and white, smearing across the windshield like the world refused to stay still. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I was reading too much into a simple moment. By the time I reached my apartment, the weight of the day settled on my skin like dust. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the quiet, the stillness, the life I had built without anyone's help. It should have comforted me. Instead, it made me aware of a loneliness I hadn't acknowledged in years. That night, I lay awake listening to the clock tick against the wall, each second a reminder that morning always comes, with or without certainty. I tried closing my eyes, willing my thoughts to settle, but the darkness only sharpened everything I was trying to ignore. His face returned in fragments, the arch of his brow when he focused, the quiet steadiness in his voice, the way he lingered in a room without meaning to. I told myself it was nothing, that it had to be nothing, yet some fragile part of me wondered why the memory felt so alive. And still, as dawn crept in, I knew sleep would not save. I wish I could tell you that the feeling faded, that by morning everything returned to the way it had always been. But the truth is quieter, more stubborn than that. It lingered in the space between us like a scent you can't wash out, subtle enough to deny, yet strong enough to pull you back every time you tried to walk away from it. When I arrived at the office the next day, he was already there, leaning over the conference table while reviewing documents. Nothing about him looked different, and yet everything felt different. Or maybe it was just me. He straightened when he saw me, offering the usual greeting, but something in his eyes flickered just long enough to make my chest tight. It was the same warmth from the night before, but dimmed now, as if he was trying to hide it, or maybe trying to convince himself it wasn't real. I mirrored the effort, pretending my smile didn't shake slightly at the corners. We were two people dancing around an unspoken truth, pretending we didn't hear the same rhythm pulling us in. The entire morning passed like that, careful, contained, almost painfully normal. We spoke about numbers, clients, deadlines, everything except what mattered. But our voices carried a soft tremor, as if holding back a storm neither of us was ready to acknowledge. Every time he leaned over my shoulder to check a document, I felt the warmth of him before he even touched the desk. Every time his hand brushed mine when we passed files back and forth, my breath hitched, small and shameful. Around noon, he suggested grabbing coffee, and I agreed even though I knew I shouldn't. We walked to the cafe around the corner, each step measured, each breath held as though the world might tilt if we exhaled too deeply. The sky was gray, heavy with unshed rain, and the wind carried the faint smell of something cold approaching. He held the door open for me, a gesture he'd made countless times before, but today it felt intimate in a way that burned. We sat by the window, our cups positioned between us like fragile boundaries. The conversation drifted toward safe territories, new potential clients, hearing another assistant, fixing the glitchy accounting software, but beneath every word was an undercurrent neither of us could drown out. He kept glancing at me, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that I felt the weight of every unspoken thought behind those looks. At one point, he paused mid-sentence. His fingers tapped against the ceramic cup, a small, nervous habit I'd seen only on the worst days. "You seemed off last night," he said quietly. My throat tightened. I was tired, I lied. He nodded as though he believed me, but his eyes betrayed him. They softened, then hardened, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for something neither of us had any right to touch. The rain finally began outside, tapping lightly against the window like a warning. He looked out at it, jaw tense, and for a moment I wondered if he was imagining the same thing I was, what it would feel like to cross the line completely, to give in to the tension that had been growing inch by inch. I felt the thought bloom inside me like a confession I couldn't voice. We returned to the office drenched from the sudden downpour, laughing at our soaked clothes even though the laughter felt too bright, too fragile. Back inside, the building was warm, quiet, almost too intimate after the restless noise of the rain. He stood near his desk, peeling off his damp jacket, and something about that simple motion made the air shift again. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than any moment should last between business partners, and I felt it again, that silent question hanging between us. Not a question of desire, a question of permission, a question of courage, or perhaps a question of ruin. But neither of us said anything. We both knew how quickly a truth could unravel everything we had built. Instead, we returned to our work as though the air wasn't thick with denial, as though the tension wasn't crawling beneath our skin. As evening approached, the rain softened into a steady drizzle. The office lights hummed above us, casting a faint glow across his face. He looked exhausted, not from the work, but from holding himself back. I felt the same exhaustion pressing down on me, the weight of pretending, the burden of silence. When he finally rose to leave, he hesitated. "Good night," he murmured, voice rougher than usual. "Good night," I whispered back. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed through the empty office like a truth finally spoken. I sank into my chair, pressing my palms against my eyes as the rain whispered against the glass. We had crossed no visible line, made no reckless choices, exchanged no forbidden touch. And yet, something irreversible had already begun. Something we didn't dare admit, not even to ourselves. There are nights when the world feels tilted, as if gravity has shifted and you're suddenly aware of every fragile truth you've been balancing on. The night everything unraveled didn't arrive with drama or warning. It slipped in quietly, carried by a silence so thick it felt alive. Even now, when I think back to it, I can still feel that silence settling over my skin like cold breath. The office was dim when I walked in, the kind of dimness that feels intentional, like someone had been there long enough to forget the lights but not long enough to leave. His bag was on the floor beside his desk, his jacket draped over the back of his chair. It wasn't unusual for him to stay late. What was unusual was the way the room felt when I entered, tense, unsettled, as if it had been holding its breath. I called his name once. No answer. The printer hummed softly in the background, feeding out a half-printed contract that curled at the edges. Somewhere deep in the building, the air vents rattled like someone whispering behind a wall. I stepped further in, my heels tapping against the floor, sharp and out of place. His office door was cracked open, just enough to tempt, just enough to warn. I pushed it gently. The hinge creaked, a dry, tired sound, and inside I found him sitting at his desk, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He looked up at me slowly, and the moment our eyes met, I knew something had happened. Something beyond whatever had been growing between us. His eyes were red, not from crying but from trying not to. His breathing was uneven, shallow, like each inhale scraped against something sharp. "What happened?" I whispered. He hesitated, not because he didn't trust me, but because saying it aloud would make it real. "She knows," he breathed. Those two words changed the temperature of the room. The lights seemed colder, the air thinner. I felt my heartbeat trip over itself as I walked closer, confusion tightening my chest. "Who knows?" I asked, though some part of me already understood. "My partner," his voice cracked slightly. "She went through my phone." For a moment, everything inside me stilled. I replayed the past weeks in my mind, the lingering looks, the late nights, the tension that neither of us dared name. We had been so careful, painfully careful, never crossing lines, never doing anything that could be considered betrayal by any definition except the emotional kind. Yet somehow, emotions had become evidence. What did she see?" My voice came out too thin, too fragile. He swallowed hard. "The messages, the late-night calls, the way I kept asking where you were, what time you'd be in. She said no man worries that much about someone he's not in love with." The words landed between us with a dull thud, heavy and unsteady. Love, a word we'd both avoided, a word too dangerous to claim. I felt heat crawl up my throat, not from shame, but from the realization that he hadn't denied it to her. "And what did you say?" I asked softly. He closed his eyes. I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because anything I said would have been a lie. My breath left me in a slow, unsteady exhale. The room felt too small then, the walls creeping inward as though they had been waiting for this confession as long as we had. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands, exhaustion radiating from him. "It's over," he murmured. "She left." The chair beneath me felt unsteady as I sat down. I tried to steady myself by gripping the edge of his desk, but my fingers trembled despite my effort to appear calm. I had imagined many outcomes, many ways this tension could break, but I never imagined it would be this. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though the words felt insufficient, too small to carry the weight pressing down on us. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing something he had been avoiding. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." But we had, and we both knew it. We had built a quiet world inside the walls of our office, a world where feelings grew in places they shouldn't have. A world where silence said more than words ever could. He stood, packing the room as though trying to outrun the truth. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." I felt my throat tighten. Neither did I. The rain outside began to thicken, beating against the windows in harsh, uneven rhythms. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, low and warning. And in that moment, I realized the storm wasn't just outside, it was already inside us, already tearing through everything we thought we could control. He stopped packing and turned toward me, his expression carved with something raw. "Tell me I'm imagining this," he said quietly. "Tell me this thing between us isn't real." I opened my mouth, but no words came. My silence answered for me. He stepped closer, just one step, and the air shifted, thickened. But before anything could happen, before the line could be crossed in a way that couldn't be undone, the building's security system beeped loudly, announcing the end of after-hours access. The sharp sound jolted us both back into ourselves. He inhaled, long and pained, then looked away. "We should go." I nodded, though part of me wanted to stay in that room forever, suspended in the truth we could finally see but still couldn't touch. As we walked out, the lights buzzed overhead, flickering slightly as though the building itself was tired of holding our secrets. The hallway stretched long and dim, our footsteps echoing against the walls like confessions we couldn't take back. When we reached the front door, he paused but didn't turn to face me. "I don't know what happens next," he murmured. "Neither do I said. And as the night swallowed us, I realized the walls had heard everything, even the things we never spoke aloud. The morning after everything came crashing down, the city felt too bright. The sun pushed through the blinds with a sharpness that made the world look overexposed, as if nothing wanted to hide anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands clasped so tightly they ached, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft ticking of the clock on my wall. It felt like the world was continuing as usual, indifferent to the fact that something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. I didn't know whether he would come to the office that day. I didn't know whether I wanted him to. The weight of our unspoken truth lingered in every breath, heavy and unsteady, like a secret I could no longer pretend wasn't mine. By the time I forced myself out the door, my heart was already beating too fast, each step toward the building echoing with dread and longing tangled so tightly together that I couldn't separate one from the other. When I walked inside, the air felt different, not colder, emptier. His desk was neat, unnervingly neat, as if someone had tried to leave without leaving traces behind. His chair was tucked in. His computer was off. His jacket was gone. My breath hitched, thin and fragile, as I stood in the doorway of his office, staring at the vacant space where his presence had always lived. Part of me knew this might have been inevitable, but knowing didn't lessen the sting. He came in an hour later. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, slow, heavy, dragging like someone fighting gravity. When he entered, he didn't look at me right away. His eyes were swollen from a night without sleep, his jaw tight in a way that made him look older. When he finally met my gaze, I felt something inside me sink. "We need to talk," he said, and the words carried a finality that made my stomach twist. I nodded, though I already felt the conversation forming like a bruise beneath my ribs. He stepped into his office, leaving the door open just enough for me to follow. I sat across from him, my hands folded in my lap, trying to brace myself for a truth I didn't want to hear but knew he had to say. "I didn't sleep," he began. His voice was hoarse, frayed around the edges. "I kept replaying everything, what she said, what I didn't say, what we haven't said." I lowered my gaze to the grain of the desk, tracing its texture with my eyes, grounding myself in anything that wasn't the pain rising in my chest. "I never meant for you to be pulled into this," he continued. "You didn't ask for any of it, you didn't cause it. I let things blur, I let myself feel something I shouldn't have." My throat tightened. "You weren't the only one." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. He looked at me with a softness I almost couldn't bear. There was no denial there, no attempt to rewrite the past, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had existed between us, something real, unspoken, and dangerous. "I care about you," he said, and the words lodged themselves deep in my chest. More than I should, more than I tried to. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. "But caring about you doesn't erase the fact that I've broken something important. And if I stay in this, if I let myself fall into whatever this is, I'll break even more." I felt the sting of those words long before they finished leaving his mouth. It wasn't rejection. It was surrender, a surrender to consequences neither of us had wanted to face. "I need to fix what I can," he said quietly. "Even if it means stepping back from you, even if it means stepping away from the business for a while." My heart cracked open at the edges. "So this is goodbye." His eyes softened with a grief that mirrored my own. "No, not goodbye, just distance. Time, space to clean up what I should have never let fall apart." I swallowed hard, fighting the tremor rising in my voice. "I understand." But understanding didn't mean it didn't hurt. He stood slowly, as if his body resisted the movement. I rose with him. For a long moment, we simply stood there, a desk between us but a truth binding us closer than we'd ever admit. His hands flexed once at his sides, as if he wanted to reach for me but couldn't trust himself. I hope one day, he whispered, we can talk without all of this between us. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. He walked past me, pausing just briefly when he reached the doorway. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. I felt the weight of his absence the moment he stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, a small sound, but one that echoed like a break. For a long time, I stayed in his office, breathing in the ghost he left behind. The air was still, heavy with everything we'd never said and everything we could no longer allow ourselves to feel. I gathered the scattered papers on his desk, straightened his chair, touched the back of it like it still carried the warmth of him. When I finally returned to my own desk, the light outside had dimmed, the sun slipping away with a quiet surrender that mirrored my own. I sat down slowly, my pulse still unsteady, my chest aching with a hollow kind of truth. Desire can be intoxicating, but consequences have a way of sobering you entirely. That night, when I left the office, the air outside felt different, cool, sharp, filled with the kind of silence that settles only after something irreversible has happened. I walked to my car with steady steps, though each one felt like I was leaving behind a version of myself I would never get back. Love doesn't always end in flames. Sometimes it ends in the quiet, in the spaces where words fail, in the stillness of choosing the harder path. And as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the dusk, I realized the truth with a clarity that hollowed me. What we had wasn't an affair, and it wasn't fantasy. It was a moment of connection that arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong way, between two people who knew better but still felt more than they should have. And sometimes the cost of honesty, the cost of doing what's right, is living with the ache of what could have been. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and waiting, and I drove into the night carrying a truth that would stay with me long after the echoes of our silence faded.